From almost its very beginnings, manga and cinema have maintained close ties. In the post-war period, at a time when manga was limited to the satirical press, it was under American occupation that mangakas discovered comic strips. These were to have a major influence on them, enabling manga to evolve into the comic book format we imagine it to be. The first links between cinema and manga were forged at this point in the person of Osamu Tezuka. Tezuka invented modern manga by seeking his influence in the works of Walt Disney. Disney's influence can be seen first and foremost in the author's graphic style, but that's not all. The fundamental principle of cinema is the idea of movement, and that's exactly what Tezuka was able to take from it and bring to manga. Welcome to speed strokes, onomatopoeia, and even framing in the style of cinema. For Tezuka, cinema is based on staging principles that are also fundamental to manga drawing. Comics are a graphic art, just like drawing or painting, but what differentiates them from the latter is precisely the question of movement. Both film and comics are evolutions of static art forms. Painting for comics, photography for film. Obviously, comics are not an art of movement in the same way as cinema. While cinema's movement is a matter of 24 frames per second, the movement of comics is a kind of abstraction of painting, aimed at graphically unfolding a narrative, and artists have many tools at their disposal to create this movement. Here, we're talking about eye movement, page movement, character movement. All these properties of comics are based on their own codes, and the notable difference is the question of rhythm. Rhythm is a term automatically attributed to movement. In cinema, the director imposes the rhythm of his film on the spectator, whereas in comics, the author has absolutely no control over the reader's reading rhythm. Authors therefore have at their disposal narration, paneling, composition, and a whole host of other graphic possibilities to guide their readers towards a certain rhythm. And it's from this rhythm that we can observe movement in comics. Basically, if you look at the same Dragon Ball frame for 1,000 years without taking any interest in the others, you'll just see Goku doing nothing. Whereas if you read every frame on the page, you'll see Goku punching Vegeta, and that's where the movement in comics lies. These links between manga and cinema are therefore not insignificant, and it was with this knowledge that Osamu Tezuka unknowingly invented modern manga, a comic strip that accentuates the idea of movement. This way of approaching manga and the links between manga and cinema did not stop there. Tezuka drew manga for almost 40 years, during which time manga was constantly evolving. A lot happened between Astro Boy and Demon Slayer, and I think it's essential to talk about Dragon Ball again. Akira Toriyama confessed to being a great fan of Hong Kong action films, and always drawing in front of good old Jackie Chan or Bruce Lee movies. In addition to paying homage to them in his manga, he also drew on them to stage his fights. Fights that would go on to gain worldwide recognition, and have had a clear influence on all future generations of manga, and on all fight staging since Dragon Ball. Anyway, there are many links between these two arts, but today manga stands on its own and has obviously built its own codes and its own way of staging. But today, one author in particular has not finished with good old cinema. An author who has made each of his works a direct homage to this art form he is so passionate about. An author who has not finished exploring this almost intimate relationship between manga and cinema, which has been vacant for several decades. Hello everyone, it's Sosa, and I've been meaning to do this video for a long time. Today I'm going to talk about the manga Goodbye Eri by Tatsuki Fujimoto. If you're here, you're probably already familiar with Tatsuki Fujimoto, but I'm going to recontextualize his work, since I think it's important for the rest of the video. Tatsuki Fujimoto is a 30-year-old Japanese manga artist who made his start in Jump SQ magazine at the age of 17, with Two Chickens at the Bottom of the Garden. A first one-shot that didn't convince either the editors or the readers, even though the author already seemed to stand out and have an identity all his own. He then followed this up with a few unimportant one-shots, which are now available in 2 collections also published in France, in which you can read all Tatsuki Fujimoto's short stories. But his career really began in 2016 with Fire Punch, his first series, published in the Shonen Jump Plus. The manga ended in 2018 with a total of 8 volumes, and despite its lack of success, this experience enabled Fujimoto to start a new series the same year, this time published in the prestigious weekly Shonen Jump. This manga, you all know it, is Chainsaw Man. A huge success, still running today with 14 volumes as I make this video. Chainsaw Man is an ultra-violent manga, a manga that dares to destroy codes, to go totally against the habits of Shonen Jump, and to offer shocking content as well as more mature content, which could be more akin to slice of life, and content that is above all more intelligent than it looks, as our friend Lillian has demonstrated several times on this channel. In short, Chainsaw Man is proof that Fujimoto is a fairly independent artist, who only listens to himself, and who has a real artist vision, which could even be likened to a whole work containing several works, whose real point of interest is actually the author himself. I don't know if the Shueisha editors have understood this, but Fujimoto doesn't really seem to leave them much choice. He thinks he can do anything, and since the public is there, nothing can happen to him. Thanks to the status that Chainsaw Man has given him, Fujimoto is now a free author, which is very rare in the manga industry. In 2020, Tatsuki Fujimoto finished the first part of Chainsaw Man, and takes an insane 2-year break. 2 years during which Tatsuki Fujimoto lets his flagship work fall by the wayside just when it was taking off the most. The anime had been announced, sales were beginning to explode, and yet Fujimoto remained true to himself and decided to move on to something else, against all odds. Between 2020 and 2022, Tatsuki Fujimoto produced 2 one-shot manga that were nothing like anything he'd done before. Look Back, which we haven't talked about on this channel since the Bedemonsier YouTube channel made an excellent video on it, which I absolutely recommend if you still want to get a better grasp of Tatsuki Fujimoto's work, this time more from the point of view of his staging and paneling. Look Back is a slow manga about Tatsuki Fujimoto, his relation to grief, and his love of manga. In Look Back, Tatsuki Fujimoto asked us about the real power of works of art, one of the key subjects of his career, since we also find it in Fire Punch in a frontal way, with the character of Tagada, but also in Chainsaw Man, in a slightly more subtle way, as Lillian talked about in this great video that I also recommend. Anyway, there's one subject I've deliberately not touched on throughout this long biography of Fujimoto, since we're going to be talking about it throughout this video, and that's, of course, cinema. As we all know, Tatsuki Fujimoto is a great cinephile, a great cinema enthusiast. In Fujimoto's works, we talk about cinema, we make cinema, we go to the cinema. So Fujimoto had to deal with this subject that is so close to his heart, and dedicate a work to it in which he could question it head-on once and for all. This manga is Goodbye Eri, published in 2022 on Jump Plus. In March 2022, Tatsuki Fujimoto announced in an interview that he was working on a manga about the Femme Fatale. He says he loves the image of the woman who destroys everything in her path. I think this manga is Goodbye Eri, and that the figure of the Femme Fatale represents a great key to understanding this manga and what it's trying to tell us through the themes of cinema and grief. In this video, we'll try to unravel the mystery behind the real object of fascination that is Goodbye Eri. Before we get into the analysis, let's reread Goodbye Eri together to make sure it's fresh in everyone's minds for the rest of the video. If you haven't read Goodbye Eri, I obviously invite you to go and discover this manga before seeing the rest of this video, which will spoil the entire story. For his birthday, the parents of Yuta, a 12-year-old, give him a smartphone. We soon realize that this is not pure charity, but that her mother in particular has ulterior motives. She announces that she has a fatal illness and asks Yuta to film her until the very last moment. Well, there goes the birthday party atmosphere. But above all, we get the feeling that Yuta doesn't really want to. But after a little insistence, it's okay. Then begins the first segment of this manga, in which we follow the family life of this family on the brink of doom. Everything we see from the point of view of Yuta's camera, so we witness it all through the eyes imposed by Yuta, and according to what Yuta wants to film. And it has to be said that the film paints a very pessimistic picture of this family's last moments. As the atmosphere becomes increasingly gloomy, relationships deteriorate. The dishes go from 10 out of 20 to 0.5 out of 20. Yuta seems to be losing his mind and filming more and more nonsense. And in the end, what emerges from this first sequence is an obsession with the mother. Yuta films her at the aquarium, in the kitchen, in the bath, in the toilet, when she's sleeping, when she's going out. And yet, D-Day arrives. Yuta's mother doesn't have long to live, and when she arrives at the hospital, a solution imposes itself: escape. This big explosion isn't because Michael Bay draws this manga, even though Fujimoto likes it a lot, but because what we've been reading all along is just a documentary film by Yuta, shown at his high school's end-of-year festival. You'll notice that the manga is always filmed by a camera, and I'm mentioning this for the last time now, since this will be the case throughout the entire manga. And just to mention it quickly, because I love the idea, the entire manga is cut into pages of 4 superimposed rectangular frames, reminiscent on the one hand of the CinemaScope format, but also obviously of cinema film, always giving the impression that the entire manga is a movie. Moreover, the movement of a film is vertical, whereas the movement of a manga page is horizontal. In the end, this paneling simply deepens the blur between manga and cinema. Our eyes move in an almost perpendicular verticality and horizontality, so much so that the movement is traced out by the author to give this strange impression. Anyway, everyone thinks Yuta's film sucks, especially as killing his dying mother in an explosion, even if it is only in a film, is a morally unsound way to go about it, and he even gets yelled at by his teacher. A huge flop for Yuta, who obviously finds himself with suicidal impulses, and it's really not a joke because he's going to make a farewell video and decide to throw himself from the top of the hospital where his mother died. But that's not without the arrival of Eri, who comes down like an angel from heaven to save Yuta. Before he commits the irreparable, Eri takes his hand and leads him into an abandoned room, where she seems to have installed an armchair and a projector. Without transition, Eri and Yuta watch Fight Club, and like him, we don't really understand what's going on. Eri then explains that she's a huge fan of Yuta's film and would like him to make another one that he can show at next year's school festival. To this end, Eri makes it her mission to strengthen Yuta's cinematic skills by showing him films. And for a good part of the manga, we simply witness the evolution of this relationship between our two protagonists. And I'd like to congratulate Fujimoto for his superb time skip between moments of simple life where Eri and Yuta talk at the cafe about their manias as spectators, argue in front of films. A relationship really develops between the two. Fujimoto cleverly takes advantage of this to remind us that, although Yuta and Eri are getting closer, there is no love ambiguity between the two, since Eri is only in love with Yuta's cinema. In short, Yuta and Eri write, shoot, have a good time, get closer. But then fate strikes again, this time for Eri. We learn that Eri was bound to develop a fatal illness sooner or later, and that she didn't tell Yuta because she wanted him to film her, just like her mother. For her, cinema is a way of continuing to live through images. So Eri asks Yuta to film her until she dies, but this time Yuta refuses, and once again runs away. As he no longer goes to school, Yuta's father comes to ask what's going on, and we learn that he had filmed the last moments of his wife, Yuta's mother, allowing Yuta to discover her last words. A small blow to Yuta's morale, but it allows him to unblock memories that he seemed to have decided to forget, or at least that he hadn't decided to film.
Yuta's mother was indeed a big bitch who seemed to have a big egocentric problem, and used to speak very badly to him, even hitting him. At this point, Yuta's father finally gives himself up to him, and in a very touching monologue, he advised him, among other things, to go back to Eri. Yuta, then, decides to fulfill Eri's wish. He'll film her right up to the last moment, but this time, he will enjoy it, and his image won't lie. And after a time skip and the character's farewell, we realize that we've been watching Yuta's second film since the beginning of this second part. But this time, people are moved, and Eri's best friend comes to thank him for his beautiful memory of her. Yuta succeeds in doing what he failed to do with his mother, seizing the moment of death and rediscovering the will to live and the courage to make films.
But it's not over yet. We meet up again several years later, and Yuta is an old man. We learn that after the festival, he dropped out of school and spent his life re-editing Goodbye Eri. That didn't stop him from going to college and finding a wife with whom he had a child, but that's without counting the next page in which we learn that during a road trip, his wife, daughter, and father all died, leaving only Yuta, who explains in a video that he wanted to end it all, once and for all. But first, he has one last thing to do. Eerie is still alive and reveals that she is a vampire, and that every 200 years her brain reaches saturation point and dies, but not her body. And as Yuta says, it sounds like a scenario. In fact, in his film, he himself made Eerie a vampire. But anyway, Eerie thanks Yuta for the film Goodbye Eerie, because thanks to it she can see who she was in her previous life. In the end, every Eerie will have the opportunity to rediscover herself, but also to remember Yuta forever. Eerie now asks Yuta to leave, and after an extremely touching goodbye. In keeping with the author's intentions, I feel it's essential to begin this analysis with a brief autopsy of the Femme Fatale. Have you ever watched a film noir? Film noir is a genre of crime film that began in 1941 with John Huston's The Maltese Falcon, and continued until 1958 with Orson Welles' Touch of Evil, widely considered to be the film that ended the period of classic film noir. The term film noir originated in France, which is why it's also called film noir in the rest of the world. It was the French critic Nino Frank who coined the term with very little effort, since he said that film noir had nothing in common with the usual type of police strip. According to him, what really matters are the faces, the behavior, and the words. For a guy who's just defined a film genre as important as film noir, I find his explanations rather flimsy. But film noir is really defined by a lot of very distinct figures. Well, there's no point in trying to identify film noirs, since they've all been inventoried. There are around 60 film noirs from the classic period as we understand it, but that doesn't mean the end of the genre either, since obviously many films have been inspired by film noir formulas throughout the history of cinema, Blade Runner being a typical example. But in this case, we call them neo-noir films. To define what a film noir is, I'll use Otto Preminger's Laura, a typical film noir, which I highly recommend if you're interested in the genre. Laura tells the story of an investigation into the disappearance of a woman, Laura. At the start of the film, her death is confirmed and Lieutenant McPherson goes to investigate her relatives. Well, here we have the typical pitch of any good film noir. A woman dies, a detective comes to investigate, and we've already got two figures, the detective, the hero, and the dead woman. These two figures are totally typical of the film noir genre, since they are almost always at the heart of the plot. In this sense, film noir is always about a man's fascination for a woman, and more specifically, a man's fascination for a figure of the woman. One of the major figures in the detective's fascination is, of course, the dead woman, as we see in Laura. But in reality, another figure of woman enters into rivalry with this figure of the deceased and creates a whole new object of fascination for cinema, for the world, and in a framework that goes beyond even classic film noir. This figure is the femme fatale, and the notion of the femme fatale comes precisely from film noir. So, what is a femme fatale? Film noir constantly develops the idea that women have a certain knowledge of men. In at least a dozen film noirs, the structure is the same. Men are bewitched, an image of a woman has been imposed that detaches them from their daily lives, and this detachment gives rise to fantasies. As film noir progresses, what becomes clearer is the hold these women have over these men, or more precisely, the hold their desire has over them. Women know how to show off, they know everything about men, and they know how to put themselves forward. All female characters have this habit of manipulating male characters. It's as if their fantasies of the perfect woman gradually become a subjective point of view, the distorting point of view of fantasy, and all that's left is a projected world. What women's perfect bodies make men forget, what women's knowledge erases, is that fantasy is only fantasy. As an example, I'm going to use Billy Wilder's film Double Indemnity.
What is it, Nettie? Who is it?
It's for Mr. Dietrichson.
I'm Mrs. Dietrichson. What is it?
How do you do, Mr. Dietrichson? I'm Walter Nett, Pacific All Risk.
Pacific All what?
The Pacific All Risk Insurance Company. It's about some renewals on the automobiles. I've been trying to contact your husband for the past 2 weeks, but he's never in his office.
Is there anything I can do?
The insurance ran out on the 15th. I'd hate to think of you having a smashed fender or something while you're not fully covered.
Perhaps I know what you mean, Mr. Nett. I've just been taking a sunbath.
No pigeons around, I hope. Now, about those policies, Mr. Dietrichson, I hate to take up your time, but...
Oh, that's all right. If you wait till I put something on, I'll be right down. Nettie, show Mr. Neff into the living room.
Billy Wilder shows us from the outset that the man is not up to the task, using a plunge, counter-plunge ratio, and a simple ratio of height and framing. The woman knows so much about men that she's constantly staging herself. Film noir is always a film that both tells and is told. In other words, film noir is constructed like a tragedy. Now, let's put film noir to one side for a moment and focus on Goodbye Eerie. As I think you'll have gathered by now, Goodbye Eerie uses many of these film noir figures and codes in its narrative, and I think you've already visualized, in relation to the manga, the various figures I mentioned earlier. In Goodbye Eerie, we first have the figure of the deceased, as well as the figure of the Femme Fatale, the deceased being the mother and the Femme Fatale being Eerie. Let's focus first on Yuta's mother. First of all, let's make one thing clear. The figure of the deceased does not prevent her character from also being a femme fatale. And here, it's clear that Yuta's mother gets the typical femme fatale treatment. In addition to embodying the figure of the deceased and the femme fatale, this character also embodies a parental figure, the figure of the mother. I seriously believe that Fujimoto has a lot of family problems. Firstly, because he visits his grandmother because he covets her inheritance, and secondly, because he talks about it in absolutely all his manga. But we'll come back to that in part 2. In any case, we're dealing here with a mother figure, and unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about the Oedipus complex because I don't know enough about the subject, but I think there's something to be dug up here. In any case, what we can say is that Fujimoto associates the figure of the mother with that of the femme fatale. And this is quite relevant. If the femme fatale is a character who knows everything about men, what woman knows a man better than his mother, who somehow has power over him, whereas the reverse is not the case? There are countless works in which the figure of the mother becomes an object of anxiety, and this is the case in Fujimoto's work. Right from the start of the manga, this mother is disturbing, and seems to have a great deal of power over Yuta. Graphically first, by forcing Yuta to film her, she imposes on the viewer to be almost the main character of the manga during its first 20 pages, while Yuta is only present when he decides to show himself. He himself implies that his mother is taking up too much space, and we even get the impression that somehow she's stealing his identity. Yuta's dialogue bubbles are outside the boxes, and often in rather nauseating shapes. Dialogue bubbles that breathe fear, sadness, anguish. Whatever you like, but nothing very assertive or joyful. Yuta's mother has full power over him because she's his mother, and like a femme fatale, she knows how to play on her appearances and her image. Yuta's mother puts herself on stage but always hides her intimacy. Every time she appears in the first part of the manga, it's as if she's talking not to Yuta but to the camera. She seeks to create an object of fascination through this film, and to do so, she wishes to leave a fantasized image of herself as a testimony to what she really was. As we see in the manga, in fact, Yuta's film is not a reflection of reality, but a pure object of fantasy. In reality, Yuta's mother forced him to film what she wanted him to film of her, from content to framing. And to do this, she didn't hesitate to use her maternal power over Yuta to get what she wanted. In the end, like a femme fatale, she has a psychological ascendancy over the hero, and plays on her charms to become an object of fascination. But, as we explained earlier, the character isn't entirely based on this, since she'll embody the figure of the deceased for the rest of the manga, but we'll talk about that later. Now, let's talk about Eri. First of all, let's keep it simple. Close your eyes and think of Goodbye Eri. You automatically think of the character of Eri, and I promise you it's not just because her name is in the title. Fujimoto already seems to have a real desire to iconize this character. When you think of Goodbye Eri, the image that comes to mind is probably the manga cover. Let's take a look at the cover. We can see Eri with her back to the sea, her face framed by Yuta's telephone. Already I find there's something fascinating about this cover. It's a pure iconization of the character. Eri takes up the whole cover, and her face stands out clearly from the rest, as her color imagery is absolutely not the same as that of the background. I don't know if you've noticed, but we've known about this face for a long time. It was already present in the teaser visual for the manga, even before its release. A visual that remained the only color visual we had of the manga for several months. In my opinion, Fujimoto didn't do this casually. I think he wanted to create an object of fascination for Eri's character in the reader. Her eyes seem to absorb whoever dares to look into them, and there's something almost disturbing about looking at this image. I swear, if you stare into Eri's eyes for 5 seconds, you'll find it extremely disturbing. Fujimoto really wanted to make this character an object of fascination and enchantment beyond even the manga's framework, and is very interested in the iconization of her character. Now, what does the manga say? Eri is an absolutely mystical character, and her appearance is very strange. She appears out of nowhere, on a rooftop at the fateful moment, like a sort of deus ex machina, or divine envoy, who will come to help the hero in his quest. In fact, we understand at the end of the manga that we've been watching Yuta's film from the beginning, which would suggest that all the events in the manga are diegetically only fictional. This would suggest that the two characters met in another way before they started making films. As set out in the manga, Eri might be thought to exist only in Yuta's subconscious. We know absolutely nothing about her, and only see her in Yuta's presence throughout the manga. Nevertheless, Fujimoto seems to make it clear that Eri really does exist, with the character of Eri's best friend who appears at the end of the manga, a character we had already seen before Eri's appearance. We can therefore understand that Eri is staged throughout the manga, and that, like a film, the director stages his story. We know that Yuta gives a monumental point of order to the question of editing. If Eri doesn't appear before this moment, it's because he's decided to, and this choice goes hand in hand with the desire to iconize Eri. If Eri appears as a divine intervention, it's because Yuta sees her that way from his own point of view, echoing his own life, and therefore the importance he gives her in it. It's also a way for Yuta to iconize her forever, and preserve the mystical aura he finds in her. But what about the question of the Femme Fatale? As we've seen, the Femme Fatale is staged, and Yuta makes a film in which Eri is the main character. Eri finds herself somehow Yuta's actress, aware that she's being filmed, and as we see at the end, her aim is to preserve one last image of herself that her future loves can remember forever. To do this, she uses Yuta, and the film she makes of him. She deliberately stages herself, as we can see on several occasions. Eri's iconization isn't confined to the manga cover. In total, she occupies 4 times an entire page of the manga, one of the very few changes in the paneling. Each of these 4 pages is designed to accentuate a fascination with the character and to bring her to the fore. First, we have his first appearance. Back has a barrier. In fact, we can draw a line separating 2 spaces on the page. The bottom space, where we can see the city, Eri's body and the top of the roof, and the space above, in which there is only the sky and Eri's head. This composition suggests that, although Eri's body belongs to this earth, her spirit comes from elsewhere, as she will announce at the end of the manga.
This page is an example of pure iconization of the character. The second page is also a key moment. Eri tells Yuta that she loves his film, and she's the first and only person to enjoy it. Eri takes up the whole page and looks straight at the reader. These words are meant for Yuta, but this page is intended to charm the reader. By taking up the whole page, Fujimoto asks the reader to focus on Eri and only Eri. Once again, the page asks us to lose ourselves in the character's eyes, and like Yuta, fall under her spell. The last 2 pages are part of the same scene. In this scene, Yuta and Eri go to the beach to shoot a film, a scene in which Eri reveals herself as a vampire within Yuta's film.
In this scene, Eri evokes the sadness of immortality, of seeing others die before you. At this point, she evokes the happiness of cinema as a testimony to life. Yuta thanks her for watching and filming with him, and says he doesn't know how to thank her. Eri offers to let her drink his blood, but before she can accept, Eri falls before Yuta's eyes. There's a lot to analyze in this scene. Firstly, all the dialogue takes place outside the boxes, apart from the last speech bubble. This paneling suggests a timeless, almost spiritual discussion. It's as if Eri has freed herself from the frame of the image, and her words resonate beyond the frame of Yuta's film. Here, the only dialogue shown as concrete is this one. As far as I'm concerned, the tropes of the Femme Fatale are perfectly at home in this scene. First of all, 2 pages iconize and magnify Eri. In the first, she is resplendent amid the waves under the sun's rays, and in the second, she lies in the water like a fallen angel, the end of a fantasy. This end is marked by the arrival of her illness on the following page. Beyond that, this beach scene is a shooting scene, with Eri playing a vampire and displaying her vampire charms in front of the camera. Fujimoto gives her extremely charming facial expressions. She seeks to bewitch Yuta. She plays with her charms to achieve her ends, but we'll talk about that in part 3. In short, Eri is the epitome of the femme fatale, with a total psychological hold over Yuta. And speaking of Yuta, we're going to talk about him briefly now, since I'll go into more detail later. For the moment, Yuta is simply the original weak guy. He has absolutely no power over women, and he's locked into his own fantasies. And I'm not just saying this out of the blue. In the end, when you look closely, some scenes are far less staged than others. The scenes in the cinema where they look like they're bored out of their minds, and the scenes in which Eri is in hospital. For me, these scenes are the only ones to show an Eri who isn't staged and who is authentic. She doesn't try to make any particular facial expressions. She doesn't try to put herself forward to play on her charm. And I say that because I think Yuta didn't fall under Eri's spell, but rather the image he built up of Eri through his film. To begin this second part, let's take another look at film noir. Film noir is about exhuming a figure, resurrecting a figure. Film noir is a way of always portraying a figure who has disappeared, the deceased. And often, the male characters are trying to recapture the existence of a young woman they never knew. And through their investigations and testimonies, this figure begins to obsess them, a sort of morbid obsession with the deceased. This engages both a narrative tension on the psychological side and the construction of a character in its very absence. A good example of this is David Lynch's Twin Peaks series. Well, Twin Peaks isn't a film noir, but it's almost one, in many ways. It's neo-noir. A woman, Laura Palmer, is killed. FBI agent Dale Cooper travels to Twin Peaks to investigate, and in the course of his investigation, he develops a fascination for Laura, while the viewer learns more and more about her, and the life she had when she was alive. It's a very clever way of developing two characters who are almost intimately linked, and a very interesting narrative challenge to discover. Film noir is a very pessimistic genre, always revolving around the question of images. In film noir, there's always a portrait of the missing woman. The portrait always seems to be watching us, watching the detective, and inevitably, it becomes an object of fascination for both of them. This portrait is the image of a missing being, something very morbid and at the same time quite fascinating. In film noir, the image replaces an absent body. It's always from an absent body that one image replaces another. In Twin Peaks, over the course of the 2 seasons, Laura Palmer is absent. The viewer doesn't know her, yet this portrait is always there, and the more the series progresses, the more we learn about her, and the more different this portrait seems to become. Perhaps Laura Palmer wouldn't have looked the same to viewers if she hadn't died. The Laura Palmer I imagined when I watched Twin Peaks may not be the same Laura Palmer you'll imagine if you watch the series. And by the way, I'd like to take this opportunity to urge you to go and watch Twin Peaks. It's probably my favorite series, but who knows, maybe we'll talk about it again one day on this channel. Anyway, what about Goodbye Eri? Well, I warn you, you're going to have to hang on a bit. I'd already mentioned this point in Lillian's video on the second part of Chainsaw Man, but in my opinion, if there's one theme that links absolutely all of Tatsuki Fujimoto's works, it's the search for home. With the exception of Look Back, every Tatsuki Fujimoto character starts out with a certain initial home, and that home is always the reason for the Epicurean happiness they build for themselves. In a nutshell, Epicureanism is a philosophical principle of happiness that consists in focusing on pleasures to the point of excess. Fujimoto's characters follow this logic. Denji is covered in debt but can share a piece of bread with Pochita, so he's happy, and when he has the luxury of being able to eat to his heart's content, he'll stuff his face like a shonen character. But the thing is, compared to a Goku or a Luffy, Denji eats because he knows that this pleasure is fleeting and precious, so as long as he grasps it with his hands, he'll enjoy it to excess. Agni lives in an apocalyptic world, but he lives with his sister, so he's happy. This embodiment of happiness is often based on the sole presence of a loved one, but this loved one will always be taken away from him. Pochita, Luna, Kimoto, and finally Yuta's mother. Fujimoto's characters are always, in reality, characters who find themselves helpless and definitively alone. Their major challenge is to recapture this happiness, to find this home, to replace or exhume the missing person. In short, to fill a void. This initiatory quest is often made up of one or more home migrations that fill the void by replacing the character's missing home, but these homes are all united by the same outcome: loss. In Fujimoto's work, Loss often launches the story, and loss launches the search for home. Loss is the end of happiness, and the beginning of the quest to find it again, and ultimately replace it. Goodbye Eri follows this logic. Yuta begins with a family, a home, a happiness. This home soon becomes unhealthy, and his mother is taken away from him. Eri steps in as a substitute for the missing person Yuta's new home. But of course, this being Fujimoto, this happiness is only fleeting, so Eri will be taken away from him, as will the family he will build as an adult. The missing one and the theme of mourning are absolutely central to Fujimoto's work. And as we explained earlier, the figure of the portrait is absolutely central to film noir. But as you can see in Goodbye Eri, there is no portrait as such. I think the figure of the portrait lies in the figure of cinema. One of the major themes of Goodbye Eri is the power of cinema. In this manga, Fujimoto defends the thesis that cinema, as an instrument of truth, can define a human being, and more specifically, a human being's identity. At the end, Eri explains that Yuta's film will enable her to remember the person she used to be for all eternity. Eri's brain may survive for 200 years, but a film doesn't die. Like a portrait, a film allows us to visualize a human being for eternity, and cinema even allows us to characterize a human being. So I think that, in a way, the portrait is the figure of the film. Like film noir characters, Yuta is obsessed with this film, and like film noir characters, Yuta's flaw lies in his obsession with his fantasy. As we've seen before, film noir is about a man's fascination with a woman, and more specifically, a man's fascination with a female figure. As film noir progresses, what becomes clearer is the hold of women over men, and more precisely, the hold of their desire over themselves. It's as if their fantasies of the perfect woman gradually take on a more subjective point of view. The distorting point of view of fantasy, leaving these men with nothing more than a projected world, a world of fantasy, an unreal world, shaped by their desire and fantasy. One of the stakes of film noir is that fantasy is only fantasy. In Goodbye Eri, the theater of fantasy is the cinema, because, yes, cinema is a portrait, but that portrait can be a lie. If Yuta had edited her mother's film to include the rushes where she insults her, she wouldn't be seen as a good person, and the memory of her would be negative.
People who watch this film might think he's a bad person, but actually, as we see in the opening sequence of the manga, when Yuta shows his film to his classmates, people like Yuta's mother, not Yuta, they end up insulting Yuta because they respect his mother, whereas they think he doesn't.
And it's in this sense that Yuta doesn't fall under Eri's fascination, but rather the image he's formed of Eri. Let me explain. As we see in the manga, the events we witness are actually Yuta's film, and we know that Yuta has been editing Goodbye Eri for decades. So there are several versions of Goodbye Eri, and therefore several portraits of Eri, several accounts of the person Eri was. But as Yuta is the film's editor and director, each of these portraits is in fact subject to Yuta's subjective vision of Eri. For Fujimoto, cinema is a distorted projection of reality. Goodbye Eri is the unreal world shaped by Yuta's desires and fantasies. Yuta's failure was not in fact his failure to seize the moment of death, as he puts it, but rather to be fooled by skewed false images. To quote Jean-Luc Godard, it's not a just image, it's just an image. Yuta found himself in the grip of his own desires, and it's this failure that will allow Eri to achieve her goal. To use Yuta as a witness to the person she once was. Yuta's obsession is not Eri's obsession, but his fantasy of her. A fantasy whose primary objective is not to define a portrait of Eri, but to bring back the missing person, his mother. Yuta is constantly trying to find the home that was taken away from him. The problem is, there's no point in trying to find something that no longer exists. Yuta's real quest is mourning, and to broach this subject, let's talk about the end of the manga. In July 1896, Russian writer Maxim Gorky discovered for the first time the Lumiere brothers' new invention, the cinematograph. I was at Omon's house, watching one of the Lumiere cinematography sessions, the animated photography. When the lights went down in the room where the Lumiere invention was being presented, a large grey painting suddenly appeared on the screen, a Rue de Paris with the tint of a bad engraving. Looking at it, we see people frozen in various attitudes, Cars, houses, all grey, and the sky itself above is grey. With such a familiar view, you don't expect anything unusual. How many times have we seen the streets of Paris in pictures? But suddenly, the screen is shaken by a strange tremor, and the picture comes to life. From the perspective, cars come straight at you, hurtling towards the darkness in which you're sitting. People appear in the distance, growing taller as they get closer. In the foreground, children play with a dog. Cyclists speed by. Pedestrians cross the street, weaving their way between the cars, all moving, living, bubbling, heading towards the foreground of the picture, only to disappear somewhere beyond. And all this happens without a sound, in silence. It's so strange. You can't hear the wheels on the pavement, or the rustle of footsteps, or conversations. Nothing. Not a note of that complex symphony that always accompanies human movement. Silently, the ash-gray foliage of the trees stirs in the wind, and the grey silhouettes of men, like shadows, glide silently over the surface of the grey ground, as if struck by a curse and cruelly condemned to silence, deprived of all the nuances, of all the colours of life. Their smiles are dead, though their movements are full of living energy and elusive rapidity. A life bubbles up before you, stripped of speech, stripped of the finery of colour. A grey, silent, downcast, pitiful life, as if dispossessed of everything. In July 1896, at the sight of the cinematograph, Maxim Gorky was terrified and referred to cinema as a realm of shadows in which ghosts live. A world in which those who have died can, and will always be able to, move. Faces that generations will see come to life, over decades or even centuries. For Fujimoto, the cinema can represent many things, but it's often a place out of time. In Fire Punch, when you die, you go to the cinema. It's as if angels were watching over us through a cinema screen. In Chainsaw Man, the cinema is a place where we learn to discover ourselves. In Goodbye Eri, the screening room is a home in itself. It's a timeless place where one film follows another and emotions run high, a place where fiction and reality meet. Film noir also erases all distinctions between reality and unreality, nightlife and daylife. The male characters seem to be daydreaming.
What are you doing here?
You're alive.
If you don't get out at once, I'm going to call the police.
You are Laura Hunt, aren't you?
In Laura's scene, the detective seems to see the dead woman coming back, but at first he doesn't believe it. What's interesting is that everything happens under the gaze of the portrait, which is constantly there from the beginning to the end of the scene. In film noir, the image is not just a representation, it's an invocation. Male desire embodied in an image that mistakes desire for reality. It's as if his desire for these images was so strong that he succeeded in bringing back the dead woman, as if this were based on an impulse that's always poorly negotiated. By dint of obsessing over an image, desire moves the image, and if fascination comes from the immobile image, the power of his love impulse can move the image. An extremely recurrent motif in film noir is that the dead woman isn't dead, the disappeared woman isn't really disappeared. This can be seen in Goodbye Eri. The ending of Goodbye Eri has raised a lot of questions among readers, many of whom didn't understand what Fujimoto was getting at, so it remains highly ambiguous and open to interpretation. The main action of Goodbye Eri's final sequence takes place in this arranged home cinema. For the last time, Yuta decides to go there to retrieve a rope. And once again, Eri appears as divine intervention at the fateful moment. As we said earlier, Fujimoto's cinema is a place outside space-time, where fiction and reality intersect. At this point, Yuta is actually confronted with his own fantasy. Eri is a vampire, and will live forever. The home Yuta was trying to find will exist forever, when he returns to dust. Goodbye Eri supports Maxim Gorky's thesis that the cinema is a world where ghosts live, a place where the world and the other world meet. And it's in a movie theater that Yuta witnesses this phenomenon. Such was his fascination with his image of Eri that it materialized. Yuta's overwhelming fascination gave life to her fantasy, and it was in this ultimate confrontation that all relations of domination were reversed. Thanks to Goodbye Eri, Eri is now immortal, and Yuta's fantasy has become reality. Eri will remember Yuta forever, but in the end, is this the home Yuta was really looking for? What's the point of seeing his fantasy materialize if it's only to miss out on the happiness Yuta had been seeking for so many years? Is the Eri that Yuta has fashioned the Eri that will make Yuta happy? How much credence can we give to the veracity of an image, if that image is a lie? That day, Yuta understood why he had spent his life reassembling Goodbye Eri. In film noir, when the femme fatale is no longer desired, she dies.